This is Blossom Tales 2, The Minotaur Prince. This is a top-down action-adventure, very Zelda-like, and I actually never played the original Blossom Tales, I'll admit, but I saw this and thought it looked very cute and very much like it was worth trying out, so here we are. The first thing to really talk about is the presentation, because this game goes all in on a sort of campfire story presentation that's very cute. Basically, the whole game is a story being told by a grandpa to his grandkids, and you're actually playing as one of the grandkids that he made the story about, and the other one is the grandkid you have to rescue. And I really like that they made it more than just set dressing for the game, because there are several moments where it actually matters that this is a story. Like, for instance, every time you turn on the game, it acts like the grandpa just sort of dozed off or had an interruption, and then he sort of starts retelling the story again, and he reminds you, or well, reminds the kids of what you're actually doing right now. It's a really cute way to do the whole, story so far thing and make it thematically appropriate. So that's really adorable, but there are also these moments in the story where you actually get a choice, because as the grandpa is telling the story, occasionally he says something that ticks off one of the kids, and they start to fight over what actually happened. And you get a little preview of both choices, and you actually get to make the choice yourself as to which one happens. It could be something as simple as, like, you're surrounded by a certain kind of enemy, but they're fighting over what enemy it is, so you get to choose what you fight. And some of them are even as encompassing as what kind of puzzle you're going to be solving. They'll actually fight over what puzzle you encountered in a cave, and you have to actually choose which one you want to solve. So it's a really neat idea because it, like I said, it's all-encompassing. It's very much a sort of campfire story game, and it makes an effort to weave that into the narrative and actually make the whole thing have this like story time feel. It's really neat. Now, the gameplay itself is going to be very familiar to you if you've ever played a top-down Zelda game. It is very much like a sort of Link to the Past sort of era game, and combat is very simple but effective. You just have a simple sword and a couple of sword swipes as well as a charge attack, and it all does its job. It works just fine, and you have two different items that you can equip as well, and there are actually a lot of items in this game, from a bow and arrow to some bombs, the standards like that, to various potions that you can actually craft yourself, to a fishing rod for fishing purposes, and a lot of other stuff. A yo-yo that acts like a grappling hook, a teleport device. Yeah, it's actually pretty creative with its items in that it feels like the kind of stuff that a grandpa would tell his kids in a story, right? Like the items feel kind of silly and whimsical in the way that you would expect a campfire story to be. Even though the combat is pretty simple, there is quite a lot of enemy variety, and there's a good amount of biome variety in the world as well. There's like a desert area, a grasslands area, a sort of haunted, spooky forest area, and some other stuff like that, which is nice. I like the variety and all that. And since each biome has its own different enemy types, this means you are always coming up against new enemies all the way to the end of the game, which helps the simple combat not feel like it's overstaying its welcome. Now, central to a game like this is the dungeon design. Since you're going to be delving in various story dungeons as well as some optional challenge dungeons, those have to be really good in order for a game like this to work. And I gotta say, they actually did a really good job with the dungeons for a couple of different reasons. One is just the visual design of each of them is really nice, and the music in them is also very good. The music in this game in general has sort of a relaxing vibe to it, but the town and dungeon music is all really good. But the main story dungeons themselves are actually quite large. They get pretty sprawling, and there's a lot of screens to them, and the cool thing about the dungeon design is they are very puzzle heavy, a lot of puzzles in the dungeons, but the puzzles don't repeat themselves in between dungeons. So every dungeon has a specific kinds of puzzles that are going to be in it, and they're only in that one. So when you move on to the next dungeon, you won't be doing the same thing over again. This helps to match the visual theming of the dungeon with an actual mechanical theming that makes each dungeon feel fresh and new, which is a really, really important thing in a sort of Zelda-like adventure game like this. You need the dungeons to feel unique and interesting, and they did a good job at that. In terms of the actual puzzle design, they've also done a pretty good job with these because they do the classic Zelda thing, right, of giving you an easy version of a puzzle at first as like one of the first rooms of the dungeon, and then as the dungeon progresses, you will slowly be doing more and more complex versions of that puzzle, oftentimes incorporating some other elements as well, usually some skill-based or timing-based stuff, until eventually you reach near the end of the dungeon, right before the final boss, where the hardest versions of those puzzles are. And this game has a really good difficulty curve with its puzzle progression, each one starting out pretty easy at the very beginning of the dungeon, and then by the end of it, you're doing a much more large-scale, complex version of what you started with. And I should say, even though this game has a very, child-friendly appearance and story, the puzzles are actually not just, for kids, if you get what I mean. They're pretty challenging, some of them. Some of the puzzles actually get kind of difficult towards the end of the game, and they are at least engaging, right? Even the easier puzzles are still very fun to do, and they don't feel insultingly easy. The boss fights at the end of the dungeons are classic Zelda-style puzzle boss fights, where you will be using some of the mechanics you've learned throughout that dungeon to make the boss vulnerable and smack him around a little bit until you finally win. And the boss fights are actually really fun. They have great music, and they're generally also very mechanically interesting. So like every boss of every dungeon feels different than the last one, because they all have that sort of all-encompassing dungeon theme around them that makes them feel unique. And again, that's very important in a very heavily dungeon-based game like a Zelda-style game, because you don't want to feel like you're repeating the same fights over and over, and having the bosses all be mechanically unique does a good job of avoiding that. There is also an instrument that you can get and play, by the way. There are some songs that you can actually find throughout the world, although several of them are optional, and these songs work just like you think. You hold the instrument out and you play a certain combination of directions to play a song, and you actually get a choice. This is one of the times where you get a choice in between an accordion and a guitar. So obviously I chose the accordion because that's not even a choice. And these songs themselves that you can actually learn all sound quite good. This is actually a bit of a point of contention for me with some games, because some games that do the Zelda style thing, the songs that you can play are kind of forgettable, you know, and that's like the exact opposite of how Zelda works, right? The Zelda songs are extremely memorable, really well done pieces of music, and this game actually goes more towards the Zelda end of things by making the songs memorable and actually sound nice. Even while I'm talking about this, I'm actually remembering the door opening song in my head right now. Now, there are also some mini-games and some collectible stuff to do. There's a ton of different items to collect, from monster drops to fish. You can actually go fishing, to various plants and things, and there are a couple of different uses for them. For one, there are quite a few side quests in this game where people have sorts of collection quests for you, where you know, they'll ask for 3 different things and different amounts of those things, so you got to go out and find them, and you'll generally get some pretty nice rewards, like either a chest full of money or a heart piece, and these work just like you think. You get 4 heart pieces and you get an extra heart, or a stamina piece, because you do have a stamina gauge, and this is mostly used for dodging and also for items. Something I should mention is that items use stamina and not consumable ammunition, so you don't buy bombs and arrows or anything like that. Throwing bombs and shooting a bow and using all of your items takes stamina instead, and your stamina does not regenerate very fast, and it's also, of course, like I said, used for dodging, so you can't spam your items even though you technically have infinite uses of them, because stamina is a very limiting resource. So getting these rewards is really useful, and it helps you in the later parts of the game, which get more difficult. And there's also an alchemy system, like I mentioned. There are several different potion recipes that you can learn. You only have to learn a couple of them for the story, but there are several witches' huts that you can find dotted around the world, and each of these will teach you some potion recipes. And there are even a couple of quests for some of these potions as well. And these do take empty bottles in classic Zelda style, and once you have these bottles and the recipes, you just combine 4 different ingredients in one of these cauldrons that you can find in the witches' huts or in a couple of other places like the towns, and these allow you to prepare some potions for your inventory. And the potions are really, really useful. You have a healing potion, which is a full heal, a rejuvenation potion, which acts like a fairy basically. It heals you when you die. There are also things like a double damage potion, a slow time potion, which could be useful if you're having trouble with some of the harder bosses at dodging their attacks and things, and some other stuff like a potion that turns you into a ghost. That exists, and you actually have to use that one for the story. There's also a good variety of secrets that you can find around the world, from hidden caves that you can bomb open and are usually full of loot, because you need money to buy things from the shops like heart pieces, stamina upgrades, and empty bottles, and sometimes full potions and other things of that nature. There are also some optional challenge dungeons that you can find that get you some other stuff we'll talk about in a minute, and a lot of the dungeons, the main story dungeons themselves, even have optional little secret bits in them that you can find. So you actually are doing a lot of secret hunting in this game, and it's the best way to get some of the rarer materials and a lot of money, and you are definitely rewarded for exploring. Pretty much every screen in this game has something for you to do in it, and the overworld is actually pretty sizable as well. In fact, one thing that I was really impressed by is how much of this game is optional. There's a lot of stuff that you don't have to do. All of the challenge dungeons are optional. You might not even find all of them at first. All the witches' huts are optional, except for the couple potions that you need for the story. All of the challenge dungeons give you these scrolls that teach you special sword abilities, but you don't even have to find the NPC that you give those scrolls to. That's also optional. In fact, the sort of master sword-like weapon that you can get at the end of the game, the big upgraded fancy sword, that's also optional. You don't even have to get it. There's all those optional side quests as well as collection quests to collect things like all the plants and all the fish in the games for different people to display. There are these gems that you can find that allow you to get a special upgrade to your sword if you get all 50 of them, and those are also totally optional, as is the upgrade that you can get. Several of these songs that you can learn for your instrument are also optional and you don't have to get them, and a good part of the southeastern area of the map you never actually even have to visit if you don't want to. So I really like it when games put in stuff that you can find on your own that it doesn't force you to do, just optional stuff that's actually substantial optional content, and this game does a really good job of that, of actually giving you a lot of stuff to just do, just go and explore and find stuff. Also, I have to say the last areas of the game, the labyrinth and the final dungeon, are actually pretty impressive, and the puzzles there are much harder, like proper difficult. They're not like any puzzles that you've found elsewhere in the game. There are 3 different sort of main variants, and they're all quite challenging to figure out and really enjoyable, actually. So they do a good job of ramping up the puzzle difficulty to the point that at the very end in the final dungeon, they are very different from what you were doing previously. Overall, it's a very cute but very fun game. It might look kind of bite-sized, but it's actually pretty substantial with quite a lot of optional content to find, and a really fun, cute story with a really nice campfire presentation style. So I'd say it's definitely worth a look if you're a fan of top-down Zelda-like games. In terms of length, my first playthrough of it took me about 10 hours, but I also missed some stuff. I missed a sword upgrade, I missed like all of the sword skills from the challenge dungeons, and a couple of other things, as well as a good portion of the map. So I think if you wanted to 100% this game, you would be looking at closer to about 15 hours or so. If you would like to take a look at this game for yourself, I will link you in the description below this video, as always, to the Steam store page so that you can actually look at it or wishlist it or whatever you might want to do. I'd say it's definitely worth it. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.